Hi, everybody. Sorry, I wasn't sure if Amy was going to do a little bridge there to the next panel, but I guess not. So my name is Patrick Bresnahan. I was just on the last panel, so I've kind of been introduced. I'm a lecturer in the geography department in Maynooth in Ireland, and I'm currently talking to you from a very rain-drenched Sligo in the west of Ireland. Um, and we have about 20 minutes to talk about the second theme, which is around commoning in an individualized world. Um, and the way that the panel is going to start is with a short film made by Common Agency Projects, which is Shane Walterner and Laura Glazer. Um, and Shane and Laura developed making and performance scores for the exhibition exploring the idea of nature as a commons. Um, and this particular film, which is only a couple of minutes long, is called How to Stand Your Ground Generously. And it's the one that is included in the We Are Commoners exhibition. Okay, so um, the panel, I'm just going to briefly introduce the four participants on this panel. So beginning with Ben Coode Adams, who's an artist who organizes an exhibiting commons called the Blackwater Polytechnic in rural North Essex. Justin Marshall, who's an associate professor of design at Northumbria University, who researches different aspects of craft practice. Dimitris Papadopoulos, professor of science, technology and society and director of the Institute for Science and Society at the University of Nottingham. And Giuseppe Salvia, an academic with a PhD in design, engaged in international research projects addressing socio-technical innovation and sustainable patterns of production and consumption. So we met, most of us met a little bit earlier to talk about this panel, and we kind of were drawn back to a blog post that Ben had written for the We Are Commoners website. And in the blog, Ben kind of teases out this paradox between the individual and the collective, I guess, in the making of the commons. So we thought that would be a good way to sort of kick off the panel and the discussion. So I might hand over to you, Ben, and maybe you can articulate those thoughts. You're on mute, I think.
Yes, I am. I've unmuted myself. Sorry, thank you. So I'm, as Patrick said, I'm part of this exhibiting commons, which it's a group of artists who come together, and the common. It took me ages to work out where the commoning element was, but we've analysed it and decided that it's in the exhibiting. So we don't actually discuss our work amongst ourselves, but we discuss how the work will be displayed. And I tend to build a structure, and then we place the other people's work within that. And it was interesting in terms of the exhibition for Craftspace, in that because it's an exhibition and because it's a commission, we lapsed into risk averse mode, I'd say. So we weren't, because we needed to produce something for the exhibition. So it was a slightly odd thing. So in my piece that I wrote for the blog, I describe this pile of commoning objects. And I guess in this commons for this exhibition, and I'd argue that all commons are very specific, there is a pile of tendency and actions and objects. And so the tendency is to be risk averse. So that's the sort of energies that are pulling the commons in different directions. There's a kind of need to claim a space, and there's a need to express our individual craft abilities. So what we've ended up producing is a function of those different tendencies or different forces acting on us. Does that make sense?
That's the tension, which is a kind of, it's a productive tension, I guess, is what you're saying there.
Yes, I'd say it's a productive tension, and you get that in all commons. I think is that the tension is always there, is always common, but the different elements between those, the different tendencies that might be political forces, physical things, people, vary, but you always have those tensions between them.
Yeah. Great, thanks a million. I might go to you, Justin, if you wanted to.
Yep, sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess when I wrote a piece for the catalogue, I'd read Ben's post, and it was really, I really kind of recognised the voice of a maker kind of wrangling these tensions of someone going, yeah, but I think a lot of craftspeople, I mean, I know it's a very broad church and there's all sorts of practices and there are all sorts of social practices and collaborative practice, but quite a lot of makers have a very hard-won set of competencies and skills which they hold quite dear, and they have a very close relationship with tools that help articulate those skills. And that is where I saw the kind of tension with the idea of the commons and the collaborative and the coming together. And I think Ben articulated very nicely it's the difference between hard-won skills and having a bit of a go. And I think that's where I was sort of interested, from a background of working in lots of shared spaces with makers doing their individual thing. And reflecting on that, I was just trying to kind of say, well, is that an inherent thing in craftspeople, that they are individualistic, the skills are won quite hard, and they really see them as their individual collateral. And I think thinking around that, it was like, well, how do craftspeople now sit within this existing market economy? I mean, that you have to be defined by what you can produce to a certain quality in order to, that is where your kind of your value has to lie if you are selling work, selling artifacts. But actually, what I think through discussions we've had, it's that actually there are different roles for craftspeople that are more aligned with commons if you move away from this kind of very rigid and sort of narrow view of what the value of your work and labour might be. And I think some degree, talking to Giuseppe, that's aligned with how we think about our engagement with technologies to some degree.
But I guess then, but the idea that as a maker or a crafts person, that you have hard-won skills, that's not inherent to a a kind of a market economy or a commons-based economy? Is it? I mean, in a commons-based economy, you have people with, you know, specific skills which they can share with other people.
Absolutely, and I think that's where commons is really interesting. Is that idea of, you know, the things we've heard examples of, like skills swaps and sharing things and stuff. There is definite value in that, but in our current economic kind of model, it's very difficult for them to have enough leverage on a very basic level to make ends meet. You know, so there is a sort of you know, you are in a quite a difficult position to do this. So you are kind of returning to a model which doesn't fit a lots of other ethoses to do with craft, how you would like to live. And I think that's where things like the arts and crafts movement and Morris and their critiques of kind of the way in which labour is valued is kind of still has some resonance.
Yeah, that's another tension then.
Yeah,
different type of tension, but another one. Giuseppe, I might go to you next, if you wanted to.
Sure, thank you, Patrick. In fact, I'd like to build on what Ben and Justin have been talking about this tension, especially on the last one that Justin has mentioned, the tension regarding skills, you know, between sharing and so, or preserving. Because when I thought about the commenting, when we had the conversations within the network with Justin, with Ben, about the topic, I realized there is this sort of tension between the crafts that Justin said with this idea of mastering, preserving a particular type of skills. And somehow I think that Leila wrote about that, somehow the guild, this is why guilds were born, to preserve a sort of skill and ability. Whereas on the opposite side, here we are talking with commons, the idea of advancing, progressing by opening up, by allowing for transformation, by allowing for your skill, for your one thing to further develop by bringing each knowledge. And to some respects, I think this is also reflected in what happens in open source making, for instance, which is somehow addressed in a blog spot. So, but this tension maybe might take a shape of a more spectrum rather attention. Well, at least it was my thought after, in particular, after looking at the nice clip by the Commons Agency project by Laura and Shane, because allow me to reflect that actually the space in between that Ben talks about in his blog spot is there because we shape it, we make it somehow. So it's up to us, and by thinking about the clip, it's a matter of us, each of us, a craftsman or commoner, understand to what extent we are keen and ready to give space to others, to reshape these, you know, give room to this space in between. But I agree with, you know, with Justin, this puts us many craftsmen possibly in uncomfortable position. It's something that, and then therefore the tension might still be there. And I'd like to conclude by quoting or sharing with you a quote, a way of saying from a colleague of mine in Kenya. There is this way of saying that if we run alone, if you run alone, you run fast. But if you run together, then you run farther when you run fast. So it's a matter of understanding what are our priorities and where we envisage value and to what extent we are ready to run farther with others. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Giuseppe. You mentioned the open source kind of commons and maker cultures there, and the point you were making there, that's not necessarily a tension, it's a spectrum. There's this documentary that I show some of my students about Shanzai, you know, in Shenzhen, and you know, this huge sort of, you know, melting pot where people have open hardware and open software, and there's this, you know, culture there around the openness. But there's interviews in the documentary with a lot of startups and tech companies that go there precisely because of the kind of creativity that allows, which enables them to kind of siphon some stuff off and make money. So it's this sort of strange way in which you see this, almost like you'd call it like a hybrid between the kind of you know, the open source ethos and a kind of intellectual, you know, patents ownership. So that kind of relationship, it definitely isn't a kind of a binary, the way these things are working. which maybe brings me to Dimitri, because I know Dimitri's written about maker cultures and these kinds of encounters or intersections between sort of commons and the private and the public sector, and how these things are not neatly divorced. So over to you, Dimitri, if you want to throw in your 2 pennies.
Thank you, Paddy. I wanted actually to talk about something else, and this is the more than human dimension of commoning. It is related somehow to what you said. We might discuss this later. So when I'm in the hack space, or when I'm doing things with my kids, or when I'm working on something in the basement, I start from something that we all use, which is the DIY culture, do it yourself. But then if I pause for a moment, and if I watch perhaps even myself or other people, how they do things, they gradually transform and become something else. So the culture of the DIY culture becomes a DIWY culture. So do it without yourself. So you do it, but you do it more and more through the objects, through the relations, through the things. You might use other species, other organisms. You might do fermentation or bread or beer. You might do composting. You might do create air pollution devices, or trace chemicals in the nearby stream. Whatever you do, this engagement with the material world, with other species, with the more than human world, I think contributes to a process of de-individualization. And this is counteracting against the process of individualization, which is assembling things around ourselves. And in a certain way, when this happens, you start seeing how people share, but not share as an active, intentional act. Very often they share by leaving things around for others to take or not. So it's a kind of commensal relation. You share a table, like in the morning, you bring something and you leave it on the morning table, and I don't know, your kids or your friends might eat this or that or none of this and do something else. In the same way, when you are creating and making things, you leave things around. And you create a commensal world where many participate without strong intentionality, and many share without a kind of programmatic or planned sharing. And I think this is almost magic moment of transformation and de-individualization. And just to add the last bit here, perhaps this is also the moment where things become more fluid and enclosures become more open. And we see in the open software movement, in hacker spaces, in maker spaces, in many environmental justice campaigns, the traffic between the private, the public, and then the commons is constant. We don't have a pure act that it is based in one or another. Of course, in some places we have privatization that might be dominant, or the state that might drive certain projects, or commons that are much more prominent. But generally, especially in how knowledge and things and matter circulate, we have a lot of traffic, and I think the politics of commoning is increasing this traffic, leaving things behind for others, bringing others in, moving into a more than human commoning. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitri. That was beautiful. And I'd agree with a lot of that. I wonder, maybe because we have maybe one last opportunity for someone to speak, and I feel like maybe it should be Ben, because he started it and with his blog post. But I wonder, Ben, because you started, I guess, or the tension you were pointing to was between the individual and the collective in these exhibiting commons you're talking about, and the idea that as a maker you do it on your own. What Dimitri's saying there is at another level or another register. There isn't that individual to begin with, you know, and that even in your making or in your craft, which, you know, obviously partakes of quite specific hard-won skills, your relations to your materials, but also where you're doing it and the information that you might be having to use to make those things is already more than individual and more than human. So I don't know whether you want to add in some final reflections or thoughts, Ben, having listened to Dimitri and the other two.
I thought it was really interesting. I think the thing about fluidity and is really interesting. And of course, what's happened in the exhibition is that everything's concretized and fixed, and that is how it's seen. And so, but when you're working away in your studio, either with somebody else or on your own, it's definitely, I'm looking for that fluidity and ungluing, sort of unsticking of stuff, so that because that's where the exciting stuff is, in the unglued world, not in the fixed world. Although I love going to exhibitions too, but that's a kind of different experience. So, but and that's that's one of the kind of paradoxes about the exhibition, is that it's showing commoning, which is a time-based action or performance generally, in a fixed way, because it's invested in objects. So it's kind of that's one of the many paradoxes that makes that particular commons.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks to all the panelists. I think that was a pretty tight 20 minutes. I think we got a lot into it, and you know, some inspiring thoughts to take away. So